Welcome back to Growth Without Referrals. Today, I'm joined by Colleen DelVecchio, founder of Maxady, where she works with leaders and organizations to help them navigate change, build stronger teams, and embrace uncertainty in a productive way. Colleen, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Awesome. And I want to start with something you said in our earlier conversation that really stuck with me. You gave yourself 6 months to make your business work, and now here you are, 7 years later. That's a pretty great place to start. Take us back to that moment. When you decided to launch your business, what was going through your head at the time?
Sure. I had been working for a company for almost 10 years, and my position got eliminated. New boss came in, right? New leader came in, wanted to kind of change things up. She and I didn't see eye to eye. And when my job got eliminated, I, like most people, was instantly devastated, right? I couldn't believe they were going to eliminate my job after I'd given my blood, sweat, and tears to this company for so long. And then my husband said, "This is the best news ever." He's like, "Listen, you should have gone out on your own years ago. This is your chance." And I'm not a risk taker. I like to check the boxes. I like to make sure that things are certain. I liked having a paycheck come in every week that I knew exactly how much it was, right? Easy to budget. And I said, I guess you're right. I'd been doing this as a side gig. I had so many people had reached out to me through the years to do some work for them. And I would take a day off here and there and do it. And I said, all right, I'll try it. I'll see if I like this. And to me, my biggest question was actually people. I'm a people person. I will go out and talk to everybody everywhere. I loved my coworkers. So the idea of, working from here, which is now, right, this was my kids' playroom when they were little, right, to work from, this office over my garage as my main place was a little nerve-wracking. And again, the idea of just not pulling that paycheck. So I said, all right, 6 months, I'll see. I have to try it for at least 6 months, because if I give it anything shorter than that, then I didn't really give it a chance to get started. So I literally put a note on LinkedIn and Facebook and said to all my friends and colleagues, "This is what I'm doing. Let me know if you could use some help." And things just started to take off. And I started to find my rhythm of how do I fill that need for being around people and still working here.
Excellent. Excellent. And you mentioned referrals played a big role early on. How did those first clients actually find you?
Legitimately, I put a post on LinkedIn and Facebook and said, "Hey, my last day at this place, starting my own business starting on Monday. Here are the things that I could do. Who's interested?" And very quickly, a whole lot of people were like, "Wait, you're available?" My first big kind of consulting gig, they actually reached out and said, "Do you want the job?" It was a job I had applied for 2 years before. I was the second choice candidate, right? They hired somebody else, and that person didn't work out. And so they said, "Hey, wait, you're available? Do you want to come work for us now?" And I was like, I've already promised myself 6 months. I said, "But what I can do for you is I'll do an interim for 6 months, but only 3 days a week." And they said
Okay.
yes. And so that really gave me that, I don't know, the confidence and that idea that I could do this. It gave me, and also the financial backing, right? Because I knew I had 6 months of money coming in at that point.
Okay. Thanks for that. And you said something I think a lot of founders relate to. You grew your business almost entirely through referrals.
hmm
And what made referrals work so well for you early on?
I think for a lot of it was these were folks who knew me. They had seen me do something, either if it was either training, they were a friend, they were a former colleague, right? They were somebody who knew me, which that level of trust was already there. And for me, as when you're going out to pitch yourself to a new company, I read something recently that it takes 220 days from when you first reach out and pitch to a company for them to say yes, right? And that's almost a year, or that's 3/4 of a year. So, kind of doing this over and over, and you're thinking, gosh, what would make that quicker? And I think the thing that would make that quicker is if folks could trust you, right? There's such an erosion of trust out there in the world. So I, from a referral standpoint, it's because I already had built that trust in one way, shape, or form, right? They knew I would deliver on what I said I would do and that I could do it and be successful. So as the business starts to grow, for me, part of that question has always been, okay, so how do you build that level of trust with somebody quickly?
And I like that. Trust is such an important aspect of these of business, right? And it really helps you become that trusted partner with companies too. And so that's excellent. But there's a flip side to referrals, right? You said referrals are powerful but unpredictable. When did you start to feel that unpredictability?
I think from the beginning, that was the thing that worried me most. And so it's, referrals come in, they come in. I feel like they was coming in a batch. Talking to another person who does very similar work to me, we were laughing that pretty much January and September, we get flooded every year, right? That's when all the referrals come back
Mm,
around and it's flooded. Every year in January, it's like January, and then I'm just playing catch up through March. And then April hits, and she and I were talking about how April, May, June, July, we're always going, oh my God, are we ever going to get paid again?
mm,
August comes around, it starts to come in, and then we get flooded in September. And it's just one of those, cyclical things.
mm.
And, as I start to get to the point where I've already hired one W-2 employee, I have 11 contractors who do a good amount of work for me, right? As I start to grow those, I want to be able to give them more work as well, right? It's more
Mm.
than just me. I want they all happen to be women, like these other fabulous women that are working with me and for me and collaborating with me. I want to send more work their way. And the only way I'm going to be able to do that is to get that funnel lined up in a better way, right? That I don't feel those slumps in April, May, June, July.
Right, right. And you were refreshingly honest about something that I think a lot of business owners feel. You said sales, marketing, and business development are probably your least favorite parts of the job. Why do you think that is?
To me, it's not my skill set. So a lot of the work I do, I talk about strengths and how when we do jobs that align with our strengths, we have more energy. We love what we do. Everything flows better, right? We really feel we're kind of excited about our work, which also translates to then having energy for the rest of our lives, right? You have more energy to take the dog for a walk or go to the gym or go out to dinner at night. When I think of all those pillars that new entrepreneurs have to do, right? We have to do everything when you first
Yeah.
start. Right? You're like, okay, I'm an accountant, I'm a lawyer, I'm a researcher, I'm a marketer, right? You're doing all of these things. None of us are ever going to be good at all those. None of us are going to
Mhm.
love all those pieces. So when I started thinking about like what were the lanes that I really enjoyed? What were the things I had fun doing? What were the things that got me excited to show up to work every day? So when I start to think of that, and I start to think of the stuff that I would wait till Friday afternoon, right? I look at my weekly to-do list. What's almost always left at the end of it is like, okay, remember to post some things on LinkedIn, remember to reach out to, right, some of these other companies who I know would be a good fit for me. They were always the last things left on my list. It's just not what I love. In an ideal world, somebody would do everything else of the job, and all I would do is get on stage and do keynotes or get in front of groups and do training for them. That's all I would do. But on the other hand, I don't want to go work for somebody else who's going to do all that, and then that's all I get to do, right? It's this weird push and pull, I think, for entrepreneurs when we hit those points.
Yeah, yeah. And you described your business development as very old school. You grew up in a family where the phrase was, I know a guy.
Hmm.
And now you're intentionally building that modern version of I know a guy. Talk about how speaking became your primary growth strategy.
Sure. Right. My dad was a New York City cop. And he was a New York City cop back in the day where he was a beat cop in Harlem as a white Irish man in like the 60s and 70s, right? So, how my dad built those relationships was he just talked to everybody. And that's just who he is, right? It's now they moved to Massachusetts, I don't know, 25 years ago. And within a month, my dad knew, the guy behind the meat counter by name. He knew the librarian. The librarian still to this day puts books aside for him. The guy at the meat counter at Whole Foods literally pulls steaks to hold for him because that's who he is. And so I grew up with that. And when I thought about my business and how I've always done things in my life, right? I was the person who had giant Rolodexes. I had 4 of them. before we all went digital. For anyone who's old, who's too young to know what that is, go look it up. It's literally like a spinny wheel with paper on it. You stapled business cards to every single one of these,
Mhm.
right? It's old school address book. And when I think of the best kind of clients that I've worked with, it's all because somebody either made that introduction. And so I said, I have to find a way to do business development that feels natural to me. And so natural to me is that whole I know a guy kind of syndrome, that whole kind of know a guy setup. And for me, keynotes is a lot of that. So I think it builds that level of trust. People see me on stage, and therefore, whoever chose me to be on stage probably thinks I'm smart enough to kind of do this kind of talk. And then I connect with the audience and I have those conversations. And even in my keynotes, I encourage people to introduce themselves to the people next to them, to the people in front of them, behind them, to kind of build their I know a guy place. Because isn't it so much better for me to call Mark Ferguson and say, hey, Mark, I have somebody who wants to start a podcast. Could you talk to him? As opposed to me just, reaching out into the world and putting it out there. I'd rather make those connections. And so I found that my keynotes are able to let me start to build those connections. People feel like they know me when they've seen me on stage, even though I might not know them.
Sure. And do you see speaking as marketing or relationship building?
Oh, wow, that's a good one. I mean, my perspective probably would be relationship building because I'll do more of it because I like it that way. Because marketing is not my, as we said, right, not my favorite thing to do. I'm very careful when I'm on stage that I don't do talks that sound like, here I am, hire me, here I am, this is what I'm selling, right? I hate going to a conference where all they do is sell from stage. You
Hmm.
listen to a keynote and all they do is tell you to buy their product without saying it, but that's what they're doing. So I try to give people things that they really want. And, the two things I talk about mostly from the stage are embracing change. Right. That
Hmm.
one is called Embrace the Squiggle. And then the other thing I talk a lot about is burnout. But the title of that talk is Great Leaders Eat Lunch. And I talk about how if you start with something as simple as just taking a break and eating lunch, we can actually make for better cultures in the workplace. We can make cultures where people aren't burning out, that people are going to enjoy their jobs. So when I start talking about that, I tell them, okay, talk to the people next to you. When did they eat lunch
Hmm.
last? When can they do things, right? Who could you have lunch with next? And you start to kind of get people to think about that relationship building. So I guess that's the long answer to probably relationship building with a little lens on marketing, because at the end, I'm definitely putting up at least my LinkedIn or my website, like something so people can find me, but it's soft marketing.
Okay. Okay. And you said something I'd like to unpack further. You talked about leaders navigating change and you talked about embracing the squiggle. What does that mean in practical terms?
Sure. Most people hate change. There's a handful
Mhm.
of people out there in the world who are like, yep, I love it. I love to, do things differently.
Mhm.
Fantastic. But most people, it's the whole like who moved my cheese moment, right? That book from
Mhm.
many, many years ago, right? People don't like things to be different. So when I used to talk about change management, right? I had a lot of talks on that. I'd go out and I'd work with teams on change management. I felt like even that people just bristled at. People don't want to show up for the workshop on change because they don't like change. One day, I had a friend who was here. We started a podcast together for a while, but Christine and I were talking, and she said, it's just a squiggle. If people would just realize it's just a squiggle, it's not a big change. I was like, that's it, right? I need people to embrace squiggles, not to think of them as big, giant changes. And I was like, oh, that's it. If I could get people to see that looking back, you look at all these changes, and that's where you got where you are, right? All those changes that might have felt weird or squiggles, right? That felt weird at the time, or you didn't like them at the time, that actually helped you get where you are. So when I talk with leaders, I talk a lot about how do you get your team to see these changes or squiggles as not so scary, as not
Mm.
so big and giant and overwhelming. And as a leader, making sure you're communicating, that you're really telling people, why are we doing this change? Because if nobody knows why, they're not getting on board with it, right? Nobody's getting on board if they don't know the why.
Right. And what separates leaders who handle uncertainty well from those who struggle?
Oh boy, I think it really is the communication piece. I often use the story of a nonprofit that I was working with, and they were changing their payroll system. And, if you've ever worked for a place where they've changed their HR system or their payroll system, those things are just painful, or an email
Mm.
system. When you're changing any of those, it's just painful. There's a lot that has to happen. They went out there, and from behind the scenes, if you were on the executive team, the reason they were changing this payroll system was twofold. One, they had had two incidences of private information being breached. And two, this company was significantly more expensive than the one they were going to. And now, as
Mm.
a nonprofit, right, every dollar counts. So they went out there and said, "We've made this decision to change to a new payroll system." But they didn't talk about those two reasons. They just talked about the system's going to be better for us. Everyone in the organization was like, "Are you bleeping kidding me?" Right? Like, we just went through this 2 years ago. Now we have to go through training. When are they rolling it out? Well, they're rolling it out July 1st. So they're doing all the training in the month of June. Well, anyone who has kids, June is a disaster, right? It's
Mm.
like your kids are getting out of school. You're trying to figure out camp, who has graduations and weddings and all those things. So now you're trying to fit extra training in. Everybody hated this. And I said, did you ever tell people why? Did you communicate that? And they said, no, they don't need to, people don't care. I said, well, see, there's the big challenge here. If you actually had gone out and
Mm.
said this, I bet everybody would have would have gotten behind it a lot easier. And so I think leaders sometimes don't realize that what they're communicating and their lack of communication is actually what's making the change so much harder. If they were being honest
That's
and saying, this is why we're changing, they'd probably get people to jump on board a lot quicker.
absolutely, absolutely. Great story. And Colleen, when you look ahead at the next few years, how do you think growth strategies are changing?
Wow, AI is out there for everything, right? Everyone's talking about AI. As I talk about doing some keynote speaking, there's some other keynote speakers I know who say now they use AI to, like, blanket apply to conference after conference after conference. And I'm going, oh, it's not my style. Like, I want things to be more connected and things
Mm.
like that. So, I think you have to live under a rock if you haven't heard about AI and so if you don't think that AI is going to have some impact on your job, your life, you're living under a rock. It's around, it's going to change. But also think in that same vein, I'm also watching it go back to some of the old school stuff.
Mm.
I'm watching in-person events become more and more popular. I think even I live in the western part of Massachusetts, and our small chamber events, the number of people who were attending in-person events pre-COVID had been really dipping, and now it's skyrocketing, right?
Mm.
People are showing up for that in-person events. I think as we think about growth, there's lots and lots of possibilities, but you have to be willing to change, and you have to be able to, right, embrace some of those squiggles. You have to be able to make those small changes that make you still relevant in this day and age. Things are changing. And so you have to be willing to kind of embrace that. And we have no idea what that's going to look like, right? I work on strategic plans with some organizations, and I keep saying, like, no more than 3 years. And even that, let's make sure that we're really clear what we're doing this year, because
Mm.
who knows what 5 years from now is going to look like. If you go back 5 years, we were still in COVID or coming out of COVID, and none of us
Right.
thought that was going to be what that was, right?
Exactly. And with growth strategies, do you think referrals will always be part of the equation?
I think so, right? Because of that level of trust. I think that referral piece will always be a part of it. But again, like, you have to grow bigger than that. If you want to stay small, there's only so many people I know, right? There's only so many people I know and who they know it's eventually going to run out. So if you are just thinking referrals, you have to start thinking bigger about it. And so I've been a big fan of referrals my whole career, of everything,
Mm.
right? I know a guy, I need to get my hair cut. I'm asking somebody where they get their hair cut, right? I'm referrals for everything in my life. But sometimes you have to make sure that that pool gets bigger, and figuring out how does that work for you. And like I said, for me, that's been my keynotes, be able to talk about it from a stage that here now, like, no, the 500 people in the audience don't know me personally. Like, I'm not going to go out to dinner with them. It's not that level of referral, but they're starting to build that bigger circle of trust.
Colleen, if someone is starting a business today, what's one piece of advice you'd give them about growth?
Yeah, I talked with a lot. I talk with a lot of entrepreneurs. A lot of people reach out to me. They've seen me grow over 7 years and be successful when this isn't my background. I think there are people who have this background. And my advice has always been stick to the things that you really enjoy doing. You cannot be an entrepreneur and you cannot start a business doing something that you're not going to enjoy, right? Because it's just going to be too hard. You're never going to be able to grow something if you don't have some sort of passion and excitement for it. And when you hit the point that you can start hiring people, start thinking really quickly, what are the things that you don't have excitement and passion for? Right? How do you start going down those lanes and thinking about what are the things that you can give to other people? If it's either a tool that you use, right? I think of things like QuickBooks makes it that I don't need to have a full-time accountant on my team, right? QuickBooks
Mhm.
allows me to have somebody who just does some occasional per diem kind of accounting work for me, right? Like once a month kind of cleanup accounting as opposed to daily stuff. And I think it's the same thing for everything else. So when you think about growth, think about what are some of the tools you can put in place, and then who are some of the people that you can partner with to help yourself grow in a way that feels sustainable and doable.
Okay. I think that's great advice. And Colleen, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you sharing the reality behind building a business, especially the honest parts about referrals and growth. For listeners who want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
I do so much on LinkedIn that I always say that's definitely the place that I'm at most days. You can get me at Colleen DelVecchio on LinkedIn. My company Maxady is on LinkedIn, and then our podcast is Embrace the Squiggle, and so we're on all the socials for that as well.
Okay. And for our listeners, I will be putting her contact information in the description of this podcast. So, Colleen, thanks again for being here. This has been a great discussion.
Thanks, Mark. It's been fun.